In 1991, two hikers in the Alps found a frozen body sticking out of a glacier. They assumed it was a recent accident. They called the authorities. The authorities came and began the process of recovering what they thought was a modern corpse. It was not a modern corpse. It was a man who had died 5,300 years ago. His name, the name researchers gave him, was Otzi, and one of the first things they noted when they examined him was his height. He stood roughly 5 feet 2 inches tall, a Bronze Age man in the Alps, 5 feet 2, and for decades, people nodded at that number as confirmation of something they already believed, that ancient and prehistoric humans were short, smaller, less developed, that we have been getting bigger and taller as civilization advanced and improved us. There is only one problem with that story. It is wrong, and the actual truth, the one that emerges from the skeletons, is almost exactly the opposite of what most people believe. Hunter-gatherers, the humans who lived before farming, before cities, before what we call civilization, were tall, not slightly taller than medieval people, measurably, significantly, sometimes dramatically taller. Researchers studying skeletal remains from prehistoric hunter-gatherer populations across Europe have found average male heights of around 5 feet 10 inches. Some populations averaged even higher. These were people living 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years ago with no agriculture, no medicine, no permanent settlements, no supply chains. And they were, on average, taller than most medieval Europeans, taller than most people alive in Europe in the 18th century, taller than many populations alive in the early 20th century. The invention of farming, the development of cities, the entire apparatus of what we call human progress made the average human body smaller, sicker, and shorter for thousands of years. The skeletons are not ambiguous about this. The skeletons are one of the clearest signals in all of paleoanthropology. The story starts around 10,000 BC in a region researchers call the Fertile Crescent, the area covering modern Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and the surrounding territories. This is where humans first began deliberately cultivating crops and keeping domesticated animals at scale. Before this, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived as hunter-gatherers. They moved across landscapes following food. They ate an enormous variety of plants, animals, nuts, fruits, roots, and insects, depending on what was available and what the season provided. The dietary range of a typical hunter-gatherer was vastly wider than what a typical farmer ate. And dietary variety is not just a matter of preference. It is a direct determinant of nutritional completeness. A body getting protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals from dozens of different sources is a body that has what it needs to grow to its genetic potential. A body subsisting primarily on wheat or barley or rice, which is what most early farmers and most of their medieval descendants lived on, is a body that is chronically short on specific nutrients that crops alone cannot provide in adequate quantities. When researchers examine the skeletons of the first farming populations and compare them directly to the hunter-gatherers they replaced, the differences are immediate and consistent. The farmers are shorter, their bones show signs of nutritional deficiency, their teeth show far more cavities and decay. Hunter-gatherers, contrary to the image most people carry of them, had excellent teeth, not because of dental care, they had none, but because a varied diet, low in refined carbohydrates, does not produce the conditions for tooth decay at the rate that a grain-heavy diet does. The first farmers have dental records that look, compared to the hunter-gatherers they succeeded, like a catastrophe happened. Enamel hypoplasia, which are visible lines on teeth that indicate periods of severe nutritional stress during childhood, appear frequently in early farming populations, and rarely in the hunter-gatherers who preceded them. The bodies knew something was wrong, even if the culture did not. By the height of the Roman Empire, average male height in Europe had dropped to somewhere around 5 feet, 5 or 5 feet 6 inches. By the early medieval period, it had dropped further. In some populations, skeletal evidence suggests average heights of 5 feet, 4 or 5 feet 3 inches during periods of particular agricultural stress, famine, or epidemic disease. These are not small differences. Between the peak hunter-gatherer height and the trough of early medieval height, you are looking at a difference of 5 to 6 inches on average. 5 to 6 inches in average height across an entire population is an enormous change, visible not just in skeletons but in artifacts, medieval armor, medieval furniture, medieval doorways, all built for bodies that were measurably smaller than the bodies of the people who came long before them and the people who would come long after them. The reasons go beyond diet, though diet is the foundation. Population density is the second factor. Hunter-gatherers lived in small mobile groups, 30, 50, sometimes 100 people, moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to exhaust local resources or accumulate the conditions that create epidemic disease. Farmers built villages, then towns, then cities, and cities for most of human history were extraordinarily effective machines for spreading infectious disease. Typhoid, cholera, smallpox, plague, measles, all of the great killers of human history spread most efficiently in dense, sedentary, poorly sanitized populations with contaminated water supplies. A hunter-gatherer child who survived infancy faced real dangers, predators, accidents, injury, starvation in lean years. But they did not face the particular horror of living in a settlement where the water source was downstream from where the waste was deposited. Medieval cities had death rates that exceeded birth rates in many periods. They only maintained population because the countryside kept sending people in. Cities were, for most of their history, population sinks. The third factor is inequality. Hunter-gatherer societies are not perfectly egalitarian, but they are structurally resistant to extreme resource concentration. You cannot accumulate a surplus of food when you are mobile. There are limits to how much any individual can take when the whole group shares from the same hunt. Farming broke this constraint. Land could be owned, surplus could be stored, wealth could accumulate across generations, and the result, visible in the skeletons, is that within the same farming populations, you begin to see dramatic differences in health and stature between individuals. The wealthy, who had access to varied food, better living conditions, and insulation from the worst effects of crop failure, were taller and healthier. The poor, who ate primarily grain, lived in crowded conditions, and had no buffer against bad harvests, were shorter and sicker. Medieval skeletons from aristocratic burials versus peasant burials show height differences of 2 to 3 inches on average within the same population at the same time. The farming economy sorted human bodies by wealth in ways that the hunter-gatherer economy structurally could not. The recovery from this multi-thousand-year deterioration was slow and uneven. Heights in Europe did not begin recovering consistently until the 19th century, when improvements in sanitation, food variety, and eventually medicine began reversing the damage that agriculture and urbanization had accumulated. The average height of a military recruit in England in the early 1800s was around 5 feet 5 inches. By the early 1900s, it had risen to 5 feet 7. By the late 20th century, 5 feet 10 or above. The same trajectory appears across every population where reliable data exists. Industrialization, for all its costs, eventually produced the food variety, sanitation infrastructure, and disease control that allowed human bodies to approach the genetic height potential that hunter-gatherers had been reaching naturally for hundreds of thousands of years without any of those things. Which brings us back to Otzi, frozen in the Alps for 5,300 years at 5 feet 2 inches. He was not a typical human of his era. He was a farmer. Analysis of his tools, his food remains, and the contents of his stomach confirmed that he lived an agricultural life. His height was the height of a farming man in the early Bronze Age, shorter than the hunter-gatherers who had lived in the same region before agriculture arrived, shorter than the people who would eventually live there again once the long nutritional recovery was complete. He was not evidence that ancient humans were small. He was evidence of what farming did to human bodies in its early centuries, before anyone understood what was being lost. The lesson that comes out of all of this is not that farming was a mistake, or that civilization was a net negative for human life. It was not. Farming eventually supported populations that hunter-gathering never could, enabled the specialization that produced science and art and medicine, and ultimately gave humans the tools to build the food systems that allow modern people to be as tall as their Paleolithic ancestors. The lesson is simpler and stranger than any grand narrative about progress or decline. It is that the human body knows what it needs, that it will reach its potential when given what it requires, and fall short of that potential when deprived of it. And that for a significant stretch of human history, a stretch measured not in decades but in millennia, what we call civilization was, for the average human body, a deprivation. The bones remember even when the history books do not.